to discuss rubrics. Rubrics are either wonderful or horrible. It's hard to find one that's in between, in my opinion. Hopefully, you have seen by the assigned reading and reading guide that rubrics are so important for ensuring validity, reliability, and fairness. In my opinion, a really well-written rubric can be the best assessment tool because it facilitates really quality informative feedback. So that's why I like to cover informative feedback first. So here are your learning objectives. We will argue why providing a rubric can help meet diverse needs. We'll look at a few different kinds of rubrics. These were not in your reading, but I'll make sure to cover them. And then we will discuss the components of an analytic rubric, which is probably the most common type. And then toward the end, we'll talk about strategies to create an effective rubric. At the end of this presentation, I'll give you an overview of your final artifact, which is an example rubric for your content area. So to start, let's just look at a couple of rubrics. Disclaimer, most of the examples I'm giving are examples to show you what's wrong. So just because they're on my slides does not mean that they're good quality rubrics. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So this rubric right here is a rubric for an art project. So within this art project, we can see there were three main things. We'll call these criteria, and I'll get to that later. Three main criteria the students were graded on: having a foreground, middle ground, and background, atmospheric perspective, and overlapping and size variation. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you this one, first off, to show you just the format, and second, I wanted to read some of these words here. So the work shows exceptional understanding. The work shows proficient understanding. The work shows developing understanding. And the work shows no understanding. What in the world does that mean? This is a common mistake that we do all the time in rubrics. We say things that really have no validity because my version of exceptional is probably different than one of your versions of exceptional. So a lot of times we use these really vague words so we don't actually know what they mean. Same thing, exceptional versus considerable, exceptional versus considerable. So that's one glaring issue that I see here. But again, I just wanted to show you this general format, as this is one that we'll cover today. Okay, this one looks a little bit different. So in the middle here, we have our criteria. This is what you will be graded on. And then to the left, I have space to write areas that need work. And to the right, I have space to write areas that were exceeding those standards. So the criteria we're looking at here: composition, written expression, usage and mechanics, and writing process. So this is clearly some kind of writing rubric. It's very detailed. In my opinion, it's got way too much going on. But this is a different format in that we have the criteria in the middle and just blanks on either side. Okay, this is the last one I want to show you before we get some terminology here. So this rubric is for sight reading. So this is me calling out Terrence and Will, my music friends. So a quarterly individual sight reading performance assessment. And you'll see that students are graded overall for being accomplished, proficient, developing, or beginning. Okay, so if they are accomplished, this is what intonation and balance should be, fluency of reading notation, and phrasing. Notice with this format we have comments at the bottom. You've come a long way. Continue to work on your intonation exercises with a tuner, particularly in the upper register. Continues to be a bit sharp at times. That's actually pretty quality feedback. I'm not quite sure to which component it's pointing, so that could be a little bit more clear, but it's definitely a form of scaffolded feedback, if you remember from last week, because it's giving kind of like next steps in order to improve. So before we look into some terminology of these types of rubrics, let's talk for a minute about why we need to give rubrics. One of my biggest pet peeves, and I still am guilty of this myself because every teacher is constantly learning, is when we give our students rubrics after the fact. So, for example, your artifact analysis, it has a lengthy rubric because there's one rubric per artifact. And for the rest of this week, beyond this rubric assignment, really what your assignment is to look very specifically at those rubrics and the template for your artifact analysis. My first semester teaching this course, I did not give the students the rubric for our artifact analysis. And when I looked at my feedback on my course evaluations, a few students mentioned that, and it was a totally valid concern because I didn't direct them toward what I wanted them to do. So giving students the rubric before you grade is so important because rubrics are actually really quality assessment tools and teaching tools, right? So it's not just to give a grade, it's more important to teach with the rubric. So the article that I assigned for you is really excellent. I love how they talk about rubrics and fairness. Our students are told where to focus their efforts. Okay, if I were to tell you I was grading you on jumping, and then I asked you all to jump, chances are most of you would jump high. But what if I came back and said, actually, I was grading you on how far you could jump? Well, if I had told you that, you probably would have jumped as far as possible. But if I didn't tell you that, you just kind of jumped, okay? So it's really helpful in terms of validity here because I tell the students, hey, I am assessing your ability to jump far. So for example, with your artifact analysis, I'm not testing your ability to find quality assessments. I'm testing your ability to analyze them, right? That's why I keep saying it's okay if your assessments aren't perfect as these artifacts. I just want to see you analyze them. Okay? So in terms of validity, remember this is measuring what we think we are, right? So am I actually measuring how far they can jump if I don't tell them to jump far? Okay? Reliability, remember your BuzzFeed. I'm so sorry, reliability, remember your Starbucks drink. Reliability in rubrics is very important because it helps us as teachers hold ourselves accountable and not resist favoritism. So I just gotta be honest. When I'm teaching online, all of a sudden I keep looking at a computer and not my students, and it's really easy to get glazed over while I'm grading. So having a rubric is definitely holding me accountable, so I'm not just randomly giving grades. And lastly, rubrics are definitely helpful in terms of fairness because we are making sure that expectations are clear. So my favorite example in terms of fairness in rubrics is every summer I work with a group of students from China who come to the States to practice their English. And we talk about interacting in the classroom and being engaged. Well, the students are adorable. They never stop talking, except for in the classroom. In the classroom, they will not look at you in the eye, and in the classroom, they rarely talk. So I started getting confused because I told them I wanted them to be active participants. But what I did not tell them is what I meant by active. So actually in China, students are expected to be very passive in their learning because any type of question, even if it's a good quality question, is actually seen as very rude toward the teacher. So active participation in China actually means being silent, copying down exactly what you're told. So in terms of fairness, we need to be really clear about what our expectations are, and that erases a lot of issues when we have culturally and linguistically diverse learners. Okay, so rubrics are spelling out those explicit instructions. They can provide really qualitative feedback. I love the use of rubrics between like an after-school program and an in-school class. I've done some work with the Boys and Girls Club, and it's always frustrating when you're trying to help students with their homework, but you don't know what their expectations are. But rubrics are able to give you a clear illustration of what those expectations are. Particularly important for English language learners as they need some time to process all of that. So make sure you go back and review that article on leveling the playing field. That will be so helpful on writing your final artifact. Okay, so I'm going to just discuss the three main types of rubrics. So these are holistic, analytic, and single point. You'll see that I actually showed you an example of both at the beginning. So most likely you're very familiar with an analytic rubric, okay? Single point rubrics are kind of like the new cool thing, and I'll tell you why. And then a holistic rubric is when students just receive one grade overall. So we're going to walk through kind of the pros and cons of each of these. Okay, holistic, again, 3 to 5 levels of performance, really, really broad. Okay, so these examples are all rubrics for breakfast in bed, which is like a very timely example since we're all at times working in our pajamas. So as you'll see here, we have scores of 4, 3, 2, or 1, and then we have the full description. So to earn a 4, this is what you need to do. All food is perfectly cooked, presentation surpasses expectations, again very vague, and recipient is kept exceptionally comfortable throughout the meal. Sounds brilliant. I wish someone was delivering me breakfast in bed, but that is not happening. So let's look at number 3. Food is cooked correctly. The meal is presented in a clean and well-organized manner. Recipient is kept comfortable throughout the meal. What's difficult here is that I'm not really quite sure where I went wrong, to earn a 3 versus a 4. So the best way to describe this, for each of your EdCo classes, you complete a key assessment. That key assessment in our class is the artifact analysis. So imagine for your artifact analysis, you just got 1 overall grade. That wouldn't tell you as a student where you went, quote, wrong. Does it mean you didn't understand artifact 1 very well, or does it mean you didn't understand artifact 4? With the holistic rubric, it's just 1 overall grade. So it's really difficult for the student to have any kind of informed understanding about where they went wrong, and therefore it's not very helpful in terms of giving quality feedback because I don't know what to do next. So holistic may be easier to grade, but it's got a lot of issues with validity. I don't really know what's going wrong, so I don't know what I'm measuring. And trust me, it's going to be hard as a teacher to be reliable between a 4 and a 3. Okay, so that's holistic. The only time I would really use holistic is if it's a skill that you can do it or you can't, right? So for example, I would first use an analytic rubric if I'm teaching CPR because I do want my students to understand different criteria. But then I'm doing a holistic rubric because you either do everything right or the patient doesn't make it. So there are situations where you do want to use holistic. Okay, here's probably what you're most comfortable with. This is an analytic rubric. So an analytic rubric will break down the characteristics of the assignment into parts. These parts, I'll explain this on the next slide, are called the criteria. So beginning with this, or keeping with this metaphor of breakfast in bed, I have food, presentation, and comfort. That way I can know, well, was I exemplary in food, but was I just developing in presentation? So each aspect is described by strength and weakness. And again, it has to be so specific, because if I just say the food was good, what does that mean? Is it my good? Or is it Zatea's version of good? Or is it Jacob's version of good? Like, what's really happening there, okay? Unlike the holistic rubric, you can get different scores on different aspects. So again, this is not just a grading tool, it's a teaching tool. The ability to use this rubric, and we're actually like showing the students where they need to improve. Okay, so a couple of components of an analytic rubric. I've mentioned this a few times, but this, or these three different segments are your criteria. So what you're grading your students on are the criteria, so food, presentation, and comfort. And then the descriptions of those criteria are literally called your descriptors. So this one cell is a descriptor, another descriptor, and another descriptor. And lastly, up top, your levels, these are called your proficiency levels. And there's actually a really big problem with this rubric, and that is, let me see if I can draw. Wait for it. We're just going to use this. This is not working. Okay, well, basically what I'm trying to say is the proficiency levels are going in the wrong direction. Okay, so hang with me for a minute. Here's me saying I miss you. Let me just Google children's book, right? This is a quality book. I love this book. Now, in a book, we are reading from left to right. From left to right. Okay, so Miss Nelson is Missing, also a great book. The Kissing Hand, right? Mighty Mighty Construction Site, The Snowy Day. All of these books are written from left to right. So in America, guys, and this is not always the case, we are trained, our eyes are trained to look first on the left side and last on the right side, which oftentimes means that we focus only on what is on this side of the page, this left side of the page, and that is because we start glazing over by the time we get to the right side. So, why in the world would we write the most important part, exemplary, on the wrong side of the page? So, it is so important that you put the highest score first and the lowest score last. The reason for that is you want your students to first see exemplary. You want them to see what is your overall goal, and that is most important for them to read. Honestly, I don't even want them reading this portion. Okay, so just to confirm, we have our criteria, your different components you're grading for. Within each of these cells, we have our descriptors, and then up top, we have proficiency levels. And again, those should be flipped so that we have 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so holistic, analytic, and now let's look at the single point rubric. A single point rubric is only describing proficiency. So the theory behind a single point rubric is, why would we tell students how to do something incorrectly? So there's concern that we would tell the students, like right here, what it looks like to be beginning. Most food is colder or warmer than it should be, under or over seasoned, or is under or overcooked. So we don't want that. So why are we telling the students what that looks like? The argument with a single point rubric is we shouldn't. So we're just telling students how to meet the standard, and then as you are giving feedback, you can tell them how they struggled, what they need to improve on, and how they exceeded. Okay, so single point rubric. It does not describe all the ways you can fall short or exceed, and most likely these criteria are your learning targets or learning objectives. There are such pros and cons to this. I really love a single point rubric if it's an assignment that we're working on over and over again, because it does provide for such informative feedback. However, we've got issues of reliability and validity again, right? Because let's say Autumn does something for her artifact analysis, and I'm in a good mood. I think it's advanced. But then let's say 2 hours later, I'm still grading and I'm getting really tired and frustrated. And then Jordan does the same advanced thing, but I'm not excited anymore. So I don't give her those extra points. I just give her criteria as if she's met it. So it's a give and take. I think this is a great tool, but I like to see it as more of a communication between the student and the teacher. Okay, so there are your 3 different types. Now, for your next artifact, which is actually your last artifact, your assignment is, pull it up here, to find an example of a rubric in your content area, or I would encourage you to try your hand at creating your own, and that will serve as your final artifact. Okay? In terms of the analysis, these are your 5 questions. So which type of rubric is it? How does the use of rubrics and checklists enhance reliability and validity? Ooh, that's good. We've talked about it in this presentation. We've talked about it in that article that I assigned. I really want to see you thinking on this question because they are such important tools. Explain how your rubric, so your example that you provided, could be used for informative feedback. Okay, so that means I want you to think about whichever type of rubric you choose, you want to think about how could I give informative feedback, right? So let's say it's a writing rubric and you want to use it as a formative assessment, then maybe it's single point. And that way you can really say, here's where you exceeded and this is where you need some work. Or maybe it's a project and you want to do an analytic rubric so the students see where they went wrong and where they did really well. Or maybe you want holistic. There is no right or wrong in this case, but I do want you to think really strategically. The type of rubric you choose will dictate which type of informative feedback you can provide. Okay, so that's question 3. How can you use the rubric to provide informative feedback? And then question 4, right? Why are rubrics effective teaching and assessment tools for diverse learners? So again, we've hinted at that in this presentation. I cannot tell you guys enough. Just think about this from your perspective. Right now, this is unprecedented. We are in the midst of trying to do online instruction, and I haven't seen you guys in forever. Imagine if I didn't give you a rubric for this project. You would freak out. I would get like 50 billion emails, right? So reflect on that. Why is a rubric so necessary? How does it help you do your best? How does it help reduce internal and external noise? How does it create somewhat of a consistent environment? Okay, so use this current situation. And lastly, this discussion question is the same for each artifact. So thinking through how you could use rubrics to guide instruction and also see if your instruction is working. So before we go, I want to show you three slides or two rather. These are two checklists for rubrics. I'm not a huge fan of checklists because it tends to stress students out and make you think you should memorize them. So let's go ahead and clear that. No, you do not need to memorize this. But this is just a good checklist to kind of print out and have on hand as you're looking for a quality rubric. So firstly, does it clearly describe how students are expected to succeed? I bolded succeed because honestly, don't waste your time telling students how not to succeed. Okay? And not just succeed in general, but succeed in meeting the learning objectives. So your rubric should be clearly aligned to your learning objectives. Does the rubric avoid unclear language, such as few or many? So instead of saying few, I can say 2 to 3. Instead of saying many, I can say 5 to 6. Again, that alignment piece. Carefully select your point values. This is something I would talk more about in my advanced course, but grading on a 3-2-1 scale, if I give you 2 out of 3, guys, that's 66%. That's not what I want to really do. So thinking about maybe doing a 10, 9, 8 or something similar. Does the rubric provide an avenue for helpful feedback to the students? So can I write on the rubric? Can I give comments? Is it helping with communication, or is this just making things even more confusing? Another thing to think about is considering if some criteria, remember here, are more important than others. Okay, so the reason I wanted to show you this science fair presentation rubric, we're talking about science, okay? I want you to think about your science class, potential learning objectives. Do you have a learning objective about enthusiasm? Nope. Do you have a learning objective about speaking clearly? Probably not. Probably not one on posture and eye contact. Maybe something about preparedness. Probably not about complete sentences in science. Look at this. There's only one criteria that's really focused on science. That means I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, probably even 6 out of 7 that aren't even measuring a learning objective. So this is really important as you're looking at a rubric. Look at your criteria and ask yourself, do I have a learning objective about each criteria? Do I have a learning objective on enthusiasm? If I don't, I can do one of two things. Number one, get rid of this and don't grade for enthusiasm, or grade at a much smaller scale. So if you look at your artifact analysis, you can earn up to, I think it's 10 points for analysis, and you either receive 2 or 0 points for if you actually upload the artifact, right? So I'm not going to give you 10 points for uploading the picture, or at least I shouldn't. So again, I would use slide 18 and 19 as good checklists for yourselves. I just want to emphasize that you wouldn't need to memorize them. Okay, so point back to your learning objectives here. Make sure you can argue why providing a rubric is so important for students with diverse needs. It needs to be so clear what your expectations are. You should be able to discuss the difference between these 3 different types. Also be able to think about when I should use holistic, analytic, and single point. Make sure you know the different components of the analytic rubric, so you know the 3 different, in this case we have 3 criteria, the descriptors, and then of course my proficiency levels. All right, I will end on the missing you llama, and I hope that you guys are all staying safe. Please do not hesitate to call me during my virtual hours, and I will help in any way. See you guys later.